Hello, peoples.
Hello, class. So this is Doc and Darby. I'm Darby.
I'm Doc.
And we are discussing the Marxist theory of the state. So what I think we're going to talk about a few broad themes, just sort of the overview in this. And we'll start off with this sort of conception of the base superstructure. So he was a materialist. He was thinking about sort of the means of construction, about the economy as like the underpinning of society and what drove things, including politics. And he conceives of law as popping up in sort of response to exchange of goods. He talks about maritime law and Amalfi, and how the proliferation of private property had to be met with the proliferation of law to sort of protect private property. And so that is like the base we're talking about. Jump in anytime you want, Doc, but the base we're talking about is like the way the economy functions, the way the goods are exchanged, the modes of production. And then the superstructure is everything else. Like everything else builds on top of that. The law comes into play around that, civil society, everything sort of builds on top of this.
Whoa. Jump in. Civil society is that all of that modes of production and exchange and relations of employment or whatever. So that's not outside of the base. Civil society is the base. But you're right about everything else. Everything, the laws, the way that we art, TV shows, the way we think about it, public discourse, the press, all of that, that's superstructural.
Okay. And so going off of that, I wanted to talk about, because in his reading, he's not discounting other things like culture and religion influencing the superstructure as well, right? I mean, at the top of page 993, I think Engels maybe gives the example of inheritance. Yeah, Engels, the housing question, top of 993. He talks about the difference in the inheritance system between England and France and how the differences arose out of cultural, like the differences in those policies are not caused by economic circumstances alone, but they do have an economic cause. So
but what I'd say about that is that I think that that's speaking less about base superstructure distinction than economic political distinction. Because here's the thing, is that what is the difference between the rules for intestacy between Anglo law and French law? Is that French law had the revolution, which legally codified property rights such that everything is kind of checked back with the state. There was like firm, specific rules about property and property's relation to the state as a result of the revolution. Whereas England and the Commonwealth and Anglo law, there was no revolution there, so there was no firmity of those rules. So we have all of this kind of scatterbrained common law rules about wills and estates and trusts and all of this sort of thing. And so when he says that you can't derive the way that those rules function from purely economic antecedents, what he's saying is that there was a political revolution in France that we didn't have, and so there was a political cause in addition to an economic cause. That's what he means by dialectics, in broad strokes, is that there's this back and forth between economics and politics or superstructural relations.
So yeah, because reading it, I got the vibe that he's sort of talking. He's saying that there's a reciprocal relationship between the substructure and the superstructure, the base and the superstructure, and they sort of influence each other. But it's sort of like the chicken and the egg thing. It sounds like he's saying that the base came first, and the base is what's important. And he almost seems like he's romanticizing pre-industrialized world. He says I can't think of the quote, but he says there wasn't a need for law before private property.
But don't we see this? Don't we many of the relations of pre-capitalist society were mediated by status, by caste, by privilege. They weren't mediated by contract, by the meeting of autonomous individuals irrespective of their genealogy and circumstances. Mm-hmm. When he says that, when later Lenin or Pashukhana says that pre-capitalist society was less mediated by law, stricto sensu, he's not saying that those societies could do without a means of meting out enforcement and violence. What he's saying is that those means of meting out, of ensuring the compliance with norms, were not entirely laws. They were obligations, duties premised in honor and privilege and status. And as we come into the modern era, those expectations come to be more and more mediated by a thing that resembles contractual exchange, a mutual agreement among the people that make up a society, that they will act in certain ways with respect to one another. And that kind of contractualism comes about in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. And prior to the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, you had a society that was much more mediated by status and caste. What caste are you from? We see this today in, not to be ethnocentric and pick on, Indian society, but with the untouchables on one end and, the upper caste on the other. Is that a legal relationship? No, it's not. It's a societal relationship that just is obeyed and reproduced, irrespective of the fact that you won't find it in any statute book or legal codification.
Okay, but so the state pops up, but like law, domestic law, which is the topic of this course, is definitely in Marxist thought part of that superstructure.
Yeah.
Superstructure put in place by the bourgeoisie, right? The owners, people who own the factories and they own the means of production. And the superstructure gets put in place by them or with their encouragement or support to stabilize stabilize social conditions. So essentially stabilize the classes where they are, keep the bourgeoisie where they are, keep the proletariat where they are. And then so another piece of that is that when the base changes, the superstructure has to rapidly change to sort of respond. But the world Marx is talking about is like not that different. The base has not changed since Marx was writing.
Well, I mean, like precariat and gig economy and the internet and like, there's a lot of things that have changed. It's similar insofar as you have a class of people who own means of production and a class of people who have nothing to sell but
that's right.
their hours. Yeah. That's the same. But there are a lot of things that are different between 1860 and 2020. There are. So what is Marxist insights into the things that have changed is an interesting question that Marxists often ask.
So would this be a good place to maybe pivot to relative autonomy, which I think that this is the whole idea of like the state is a kind of its own bureaucratic class that has its own interests, sort of takes on a life of its own. In certain
instances, I think that's important to note. When we say that the state has relative autonomy, first of all, it has relative autonomy in certain times and under certain conditions. And second of all, what the Marxist view really is that it's only relative autonomy. Ultimately, if there are limits to what the state can independently, autonomously do, separate from the wishes and interests of the owning class. And I think that you very much see the practical reality of what that means when you look at figures like Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, where as soon as a political figure wants to become elected on a platform of restricting the ambit of the rights and interests of the owning class, you get just a dump truck of these crazy people who are threatening to blow up society, and suddenly all of the privately owned presses and all of the large chattering classes of monopoly communications just descend with a, as I said, dump truck of vitriol against the idea that these people could hold political power. That is a demonstration of the relativeness of the autonomy of the political. Now, what's an instance of the autonomy of the political as opposed to the relativeness of the relative autonomy? I think a good example of that would be George Bush and the Iraq War. I mean, was the Iraq War in the interests of American capital? Maybe it was in the interests of a few weapon makers and oil conglomerates, but overall, I think that it was pretty deleterious to the United States, and that the fat cats on Wall Street might disagree that it was you got one. You got Donald Trump, who's, it's terrible, the worst idea in the world. I was always against it. But, and so the choice to go to war was very much an exercise of the relative autonomy of the state. And it doesn't really correspond to either the on behalf of capital or at the behest of capital. It was a true instance of the exercise of executive political discretion.
I think somewhere in the textbook it talks about the relative autonomy. The state has more autonomy in times of like emergency, when there's more violence, when there are these sort of vacuums of power, when the social conditions are destabilized for whatever reason. And I think, but reading that, I was thinking a little bit about the pandemic and what I have thought about for a while. These governments all across Canada, provincial governments, and even the federal government are sort of saying like, shut stuff down, shut businesses down. These are things that are bad for the economy, and I would imagine bad for the ruling class in a lot of ways, but it's sort of allowed to happen. Is that maybe an example of their relative autonomy showing?
Absolutely. And I mean, to mention it again, I think that if you're looking at why was the state allowed to go to war in Iraq, it was in the aftermath of 9/11. Mm-hmm. And, suddenly, we got to do something, blah, blah, blah. These times of great societal chaos, the state takes on its public power grows in proportion with the disorder that exists around it, which is why Marx and Engels say that the state's power particularly grows when the fight between classes reaches a fever pitch. And basically, what's interesting is that in these moments when the state takes on a greater public power, the reason that they usually tilt the scales a little bit towards the owning class, Engels basically says that the explanation for that is sociological, is that the people who comprise the state are themselves usually drawn from the ranks of the dominant economic class. Yeah, and right. So in their benevolent, we're the state, we're gonna, put our fists on this and clamp down on this disorder. The way that they clamp down on that disorder usually favors members of their own class as opposed to other classes that may be involved in the civil strife going on.
I guess, now I think we should talk about sort of the Marxist view of ideology. So there's this discussion at page 1003, I think, where they're talking about, I think it's the German ideology. Yeah. They're talking about the ruling class is the ruling material force and the ruling intellectual force. So they're sort of like creating ideology or setting the values, setting the priorities of a society. And for Marx, they're just setting out an ideology that justifies the existing structure. That's what ideology is. That Marxists do not have much time for ideology. It's very like meat and potatoes. This is how stuff gets made. Ideology is sort of like, I don't know, the opiate of the masses is the right term, but they don't have much time for ideology at all, which is a little like concerning to read it. I don't know what your response is, but I think somewhere in the text it also says that they're not legal naturalists. They don't think about human rights. Human rights is, the state is the state. Law is what it's going to be. If people are going to be punished and not respect human rights, that's sort of the way it is. There's no real normative critique there. Is that right?
Well, here's what I'd say about it is that, you saw that clip with Zizek. I'm going to share that with the rest of the group. Okay. Yeah, but when the last thing that Zizek says, he says, what I advocate for is a Marxist return to Hegel, because Marx's roots are in Hegel. And what ideology is for a historical materialist or a dialectical materialist is the thought of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Immanuel Kant, Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, Plato, Aristotle. These are the ideas that are intrinsic to and fundamental to societies in their development, that have captured something crucial about development. So these are the modes of thought of materialist thinkers. They might seem to have no ideology because they don't have a lot of time for the ideology that is prevalent in capitalist society. Why is this important? Why is it important that they solely have the thought of Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, Hobbes, Kant, Hegel, and then stop thinking that thought is important there? So stop thinking that the thinkers thereafter, except for the ones that are kind of in their circle and they're responding to, are important. Marx considers responding to Proudhon, and Proudhon is not a Marxist, to be much more important than responding to any of the apologists and ideologists of capitalism. Why is that? Because Joseph Proudhon and Marx, Proudhon from a kind of exchangist anarchist perspective, Marx from a historical materialist perspective, are both scientifically addressing themselves to the phenomena of society under capitalist social relations. And what they're really accusing the official academic professors in capitalist countries of is having stopped scientifically analyzing their own countries. There's not a lot of back and forth between them, precisely because they just say, you're not doing rigorous science here. Marx, Proudhon, Bakhtin, despite their different tactical analyses and conclusions about societies, they consider amongst themselves that they are doing science, that they are scientifically analyzing the societies that are present around them and historical processes. And so they value each other's thought as much as they radically disagree amongst one another than they do the thought of the official academic professors of capitalist society, who they believe have just abandoned the rigors of science in social science entirely.
It sounds like you're not saying that there's no room for ideology in Marxism. It's not like baked in. You kind of have to look elsewhere for it, maybe? Is that a good way to sum up what you...
I would say that they only have... Ideology concerns modes of thinking, and Marxists only have time for the greatest thinkers of all time.
In that same vein, then, the Marxists look at rule of law in sort of the same way they look at other law, which is there to hold up to support the ruling class, to enforce the interests of the ruling class, because it is kind of an ideology that they don't really, there's no scientific basis for it. Is that?
I think that when you look at the rule of law, what it is a legitimation device. What it's doing is saying that everybody is subject to the same law, weak and powerful. Everybody is subject to the law. Now, that doesn't tell you anything about the content of the law. I think that viewing it as a system of legitimation for the existing capital nation states is, that's how you have to view it. View it in the same way as employment standards legislation or, human rights law. It's a means of saying a concession,
Yeah.
Don't revolt.
Don't revolt.
Just
remain calm.
Remain calm. We'll give you some human rights law and some rule of law and some, welfare legislation.
Yeah, and so I think, and the thing the Marxists say there as well is in the book, maybe there's the example of like contract law, and contract law applies to everyone, but we never look at the content of that law and the fact that contract law does not look at the imbalance of bargaining powers or the fact that, these corporations have massive legal teams drafting these documents, and then the other guy's just a worker.
Yeah. And that's, I don't know if you want to jump into it, but it's like that's the Pashukanis reading that we have. So Pashukanis is an interesting distinction. So first of all, he fits into the category of just criticism of Anglo-American law from the perspective of a non-Anglo-American country, from the Soviet bloc. In the 1920s, 1930s, he's writing. So first of all, he's an outsider critic. But what does he say constitutes the basis of Anglo law? Is contract. He says that his theory of law is the commodity form theory of law, that just as the capitalist mode of production and exchange is characterized by an immense accumulation and circulation of commodities, so is the legal system of those societies in which the capitalist modes of production and exchange are dominant, consists of an immense accumulation of legal relations and contractual relations. I forget how I got into Pasha, but it's like that's what he thinks of, Anglo law, is that its basis is in contract, and it's just a hypertrophy of contractual relations, which I basically agree with. Like our public law is porous and underdeveloped at best. I mean, the heart of our law, the kind of rights that are absolutely enforced, that that the courts can get the police out on the case immediately and deploying their monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, is for property rights. So that's what Pasha is really highlighting, is he's saying that the law grows out of property relations. And the criticism that the text launches is the same one that you kind of leveled earlier, is to say, well, there was law prior to the development of commodity production and exchange. It's like, yeah, there was, but it was mostly to do with the commodity of land, and it had to do with the stabilization of ownership of that commodity in land. And in the late, in the middle of the millennium, 1500 and thereafter, the alienation of land and labor became more and more of a concern. And that alienation so that the commodities of land and labor can circulate, is mediated by contracts,
Right.
So
I have like a modern example of so I read this case came out in the summer that I just happened to read because I was sort of like browsing the SEC website, that Uber Technologies v. Heller. Have you heard about this case or know anything about it? So this guy is an Uber driver, and as part of the Uber agreement, you sign saying that, like, if you have a problem with Uber, you have to go to arbitration. But the arbitration is in the Netherlands, and the filing fee is like something like $18,000, 18,000 euros, right? So he takes Uber to court here, and it's and says
this is unfair. I should have the right to this adjudicated.
Yes. So he makes all kinds of arguments about, and part of them is like that he's an employee. But the big one, the winner, was unconscionability. And I don't know how much you remember about unconscionability, but it was interesting to me because the court went with unconscionability. The majority went with unconscionability because of imbalance in bargaining powers between these two parties, which the big argument from Uber was like, what do you mean imbalance in bargaining power? Like, we don't know who this person is. They sign like a form online that's the same that we give these standard form contracts are everywhere. How can there be an imbalance? And the court seems to be sort of recognizing that, there's an imbalance. There's definitely an imbalance in these kind of standard form contracts where you can't negotiate any of the terms. And if you want access to the service, or to this case, to the income, you just sort of have to sign and agree with it. But the dissent, it's Cote and dissent, and she is like so corporate, dude. She is like so uncool. And and she's essentially saying that no, this is totally wrong. You can't look behind these contracts. It is essentially a love letter to what's that term for that phrase that means like
freedom of contract,
sanctity of contract, whatever. Yeah. And it's a really interesting case. I would highly recommend reading just the head notes, but it made me think of it. We're talking about contracts.
Absolutely. And so it brings up two things about that. First of all, is on the 30,000 foot view thing, that reflects a change in the base and the superstructure. It's a perfect little example. Is what is going on is that in the economic base, the mode of relation of employee to employer has changed as a result of these app employers. That's part of the base. That's a really easy kind of like, that's economic base. That an employee might sign a standard form and just become an employee overnight, but be a kind of a gig worker, work these hours, blah, blah, blah. That mode of relation, that social relation of production, and in this case, exchange, because Uber is a kind of exchange. Their service is in the nature of exchange. That's economic base. But the superstructural change is in this court case. It reflects the ideological consideration of this change in the base. Mm-hmm. You have we can see the literal command capsule of the Canadian law superstructure meditating on changes in the economic base. And when the Canadian court says, hey, this kind of contract reflects an imbalance of power. There was also the Foodora case. I don't know if you read, the Foodora was a labor relations case, but the decision came down and it basically said, look, these people are employees. They're not independent contractors.
Right.
They're your employees. So that labor board case and the SEC case that you're talking about, what they reflect is the superstructural apparatus of Canada meditating on the base of economic relations and saying we have to adapt our superstructural conception of economic relations to accommodate changes in the base.
Just one thing I want to say before I lose it is that it's also interesting the way, like you talked about the distinction between employee and independent contractor, right? The reason these companies are doing this and saying you're an independent contractor is to reflect employment law, right? It's changing, the base is changing because of a response to law, right? And I think Marx a Marxist would look at this and say there's something reciprocal going on here. The superstructure is creating this law and the base is responding to it, which is going to change the superstructure, which is going to
there's something dialectical going on.
Something dialectical, yeah.
That's it. That's exactly it. I mean, the fact is, one can't say that the law doesn't have a profound impact on people's lives. It does. Mm-hmm. It's not just an illusory thing. It's in Poulantzas's terms, how we organize and determine the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of violence.
Thanks for listening, everyone. This has been a little podcast by myself and Doc on Marxist Theories of Law in the State. Any closing words, Doc? Any thoughts?
Yeah, closing comments. Just that. What is a Marxist theory of the state? That the capital nation states are riven by contradictions stemming from privation in the modes of production and exchange, and particularly the concept of private property, which emerges historically. And they want a state that is not riven by such contradictions. Marxists usually analyze the state as beholden to capitalist interests, occasionally directly at the behest of capitalist interests, and occasionally indirectly on behalf of capitalist interests. And what is a Marxist conception of law? Law under conditions of capitalist exchange is riven by the contradictions of private property and reflects the interests of private property, and that interest has historically developed, and a Marxist law seeks to ameliorate or attenuate the private character of law to the greatest extent possible. That's the end takeaway of what Marxists think about law in the state.
Very well said, Doc. And if you like Bernie Sanders,